It is Friday, July 20th, 1984, and the Reverend Sun Myung Moon is going to jail for the 6th time in his life. Respectfully bowing to one another in the traditional Korean manner, his family readies itself for his long absence and reaffirms its support of him. For government prosecutors, it is a day of victory, and perhaps for scores of Americans, their hearts will gladden with the news on their television sets. But for members of his church, it is a time of new determination. For those of us on the outside, he remains an enigma whose presence is as commanding as it is disturbing. Is he a true religious leader, or simply a charlatan whose gross deceptions have been exposed? Is his incarceration justice due, or another case of religious intolerance? Why did he come here in the first place? Who are his followers? What is his real motivation? These are the questions we sought to answer, and this is what we found. He was born January 6th, 1920, in Jeongju, in the province of Pyeongbokdo, in what is today North Korea. The second son in a family of 8 children, his parents were simple farmers who were referred to by what is known in the Korean as those who could live without law, distinguishing them as people who could live by conscience alone. When he was 10 years old, his family converted to Christianity, and those who knew the young boy testified to his profound seriousness at that time. I had a very strong desire to live a life of high dimension, he told a group of followers in 1970. I started praying for extraordinary things. Korea at that time was under the iron fist of Japanese colonial rule, and the thrust of Japan's policy was the total annihilation of Korean culture. Use of the Japanese language was mandatory in public places. Christianity was forbidden, while participation in Japanese Shinto rituals was compulsory. On Easter Sunday morning, 1936, Reverend Moon tells us that while he was deep in prayer, the Spirit of Jesus appeared to him and told him that the mission for the accomplishment of God's will on earth was unfulfilled. Could he now be responsible for the accomplishment of that mission? Reverend Moon took the vision in earnest, but he knew that if the meaning of the vision were to be understood fully, he had much to learn and much to endure. He spent the next 9 years studying in Japan and praying over the many complex and unsolved mysteries of the Bible. Through this search, he received the fundamental principles which guide his life and form the core of his teachings. With the American defeat of Japan in 1945, Korea was liberated from 40 years of Japanese domination. Reverend Moon returned to Korea, where he married and began to preach. But by February of 1946, the communists were dominating North Korea under the leadership of a man chosen by the Russians, Kim Il-sung. Kim had been trained by the Chinese Red Army and accompanied it as it marched into North Korea. Refugees poured south trying to flee the chaos and bloodshed of the North. It was at this time, Reverend Moon tells us, that God told him to leave his family and go into North Korea to confront the growing acceptance of atheistic communism. Failing to understand such a commitment to his mission, his wife would divorce him years later. On July 1st, 1946, he arrived in Pyongyang, a city that at that time had so many churches it was called the Jerusalem of the East. Reverend Won-pil Kim, the first man to follow the young teacher, recalls those days in Pyongyang.
Centering upon one family's home, Reverend Moon would give his message to the people. There he prayed and spoke his new understanding of truth. In his services, he would always start with tears and end with tears. That was the spirit he was always in. It was not uncommon for people to stay late into the night listening to teacher. Many Christians did not return to their churches after they heard Reverend Moon's sermons, and the churches would begin to face financial difficulty. The ministers then tried to stop their members from coming, usually by witnessing bad things about Reverend Moon. When that did not work, they wrote letters to the communist authorities complaining.
On August 11th, 1947, Reverend Moon was arrested by North Korean authorities. He was interrogated, beaten, and tortured until believed dead. His body was then thrown into a snowbank outside the prison walls. He was found by a few followers and nursed back to health with what one person described as a mixture of herbal medicine and prayer. He soon began to teach once again, attracting numerous members from churches throughout the city. By 1948, the communists were in full control of North Korea. Ministers again wrote letters to the communist authorities complaining about Reverend Moon, and on February 22, 1948, he was again arrested. Charged with advocating social chaos, he was sentenced to 5 years of hard labor at the notorious death camp in Hongnam. Within the camp, prisoners working in twos were required to fill 80-pound bags with sodium fertilizer, then load them onto railroad cars. The diet consisted of 1 small bowl of rice and seaweed soup per day. Mr. Chung Hwa Park, a fellow prisoner with Reverend Moon in Hongnam, recalls the experience.
Hongnam prison was such a terrible place to live. Everywhere, people were dying. One day, a young man helped me with my work. His name was Sun Myung Moon. I could never forget about him because there was such a small amount of food and he always gave half to others, and also his water. Even with such a small amount, he didn't drink everything. He would save a little bit so that he could wash his body in the morning before he prayed.
With the Russians supplying the arms and assistance necessary, North Korean troops poured across the 38th parallel into South Korea on June 25, 1950. 16 nations under the United Nations flag, led by General Douglas MacArthur, responded with a South cry of desperation. The beginning of the war was a rout, but a massive counteroffensive, launched to coincide with MacArthur's incredibly daring landing at Incheon on the western coast, allowed the UN forces to push the invaders back north of the 38th parallel by the middle of September. With United Nations forces nearing Hungnam, the prisoners were told to prepare for a systematic evacuation. In reality, they were being taken away and executed in mass graves. On the day Reverend Moon was to be executed, United Nations forces liberated Hungnam and its prisoners. Soon after, Sun Myung Moon, Chung Hwa Park, and Won-pil Kim began the arduous journey south. It was November 4th, 1950.
Because I had been a communist leader, they were now trying to kill me. They broke my legs. At that time, I had to determine my feelings whether or not to go with Teacher. He brought a bicycle and put me on it and pushed me. In my mind, I thought he is surely a great man of God. Such a terrible situation.
Although the journey south took 10 days for most refugees, it took Reverend Moon's party almost 2 months. With major roads restricted to military use, the refugees fleeing south had to take remote routes, many of which crossed dangerous mountain passes.
Between Hukdu and Hwangju, there's a 130-meter mountain. It was so difficult to push the bicycle. It was impossible. So I told him, please, leave me here and go on with Won-pil Kim. Teacher told Won-pil to take the bicycle, and he told me to come on his back. Teacher told me there are so many things happening in the future. For you, for us, me, and Won-pil. Heaven will help us, so please, don't be weak-minded. That is how we crossed the mountain, with me on his back.
Attempting to reach an island off the coast near Haeju, where they had been told boats were taking refugees to Busan, the trio traversed the tidal range to the island only to discover that no boats remained. This recently discovered photograph by an unknown UN photographer remarkably captured Reverend Moon carrying Chung Hwa Park during their 2.5-mile trek back to the mainland.
At that time of war, people had to give up their parents, children, wife, everything. Yet Reverend Moon was trying to save me. He kept telling us about what the future world would be. I was really amazed, and I determined I had to follow him, even though I might die.
Reverend Moon commented to me that Mr. Park was a representative of all mankind, because from God's point of view, all mankind is, in a sense, crippled.
Using American Forces ration boxes and scrap tin, Reverend Moon built his first church when they arrived in Pusan in January of 1951. The number of refugees arriving in Pusan and the scarcity of materials available made such a construction necessary for many refugees. It was here that he actually began writing down the insights which he had received years before and which were to later become known as the divine principle.
Well, I do think that this is an age of science and reason, and many of the concepts about the nature of God that have been explained metaphorically in the past are explained much more clearly through the principle. That is, the qualities of God, the attributes of God, the way in which God works historically. Now, what Reverend Moon has done in his both revelation and reason presented through the divine principle is offer us a contemporary view drawing upon a very ancient tradition, something by which we can understand the human condition in relationship to God.
He's the first one, probably ever, walked on the face of the earth, explained and introduced God of brokenhearted. Why he was brokenhearted? Because he intended to build kingdom on earth, loving children of God. But because of the fall of man, the man is departed from him and everybody become sort of a prodigal son. And in a way, like a parent who lost their children. That's the heart of God. He described that God in such a way that he wept himself for that God, and made millions of people around the world wept for that God. And that is probably one of the deepest things I grasped, I felt and I learned from Reverend Moon. Reverend Moon is one man who knows the heart of God.
On May 1st of 1954, Reverend Moon and 4 other followers officially registered the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity.
Our original intent was not to establish another church, but as an association of Christians in Korea, to unify the denominations of Christianity and all the religions of the world centered upon Christianity.
Mrs. Won Pak Che, personal secretary to Reverend Moon for over 20 years, recalls her first meeting with the church in Seoul.
It was Thursday evening, one day, in the early part of December 1954, when I first visited the Unification Church. My first impression of the church was simply not a church, but a small, shabby old 2-room house. Now, to describe the people in the house that evening, many of them were young university students.
Professor Che was actually there on an assignment from Maria Pak, the president of Ewha University, where Professor Che was dean of students. She and another professor, Young-Un Kim, who was chairman of Ewha's Religious Studies Department, had both been sent to bring back several students who would become members of what the university termed the heretical church.
I was drawn by the logic, theory, and reason of the biblical interpretations. At the second visit, and the successive ones, I found myself drawn deeper and deeper. On the 7th evening, when Reverend Moon began to cry during his prayer, I cried my heart out. He looked different. He looked like someone I had known for a long, long time. From that day on, I began to call him Father. We joined the church, of course, and left the university. Persecution came against us from all sources and all levels. We tried our very best to encourage the people to come and listen to the lecture even once. But they muffled their ears, saying, "No, we do not care to listen."
After 100 students and professors joined the Unification Church, the university forced the members to choose between the church and the university. At that point, even the newspapers protested her injustice, especially since Ewha University was itself a Christian college. On May 14, 1950, the Ewha administration expelled all the students and faculty associated with Reverend Moon, including Professors Che and Kim. Rumors were instigated alleging that the church engaged in illicit sexual activities. and also a form of terror manipulation used by communist North Korea called brainwashing. The news was headlines. The Unification Church is the church of fornication. There is a back room with many young girls there, reported Maria Pak, and they have 3 days of brainwashing. On July 4th, 1955, Reverend Moon and 4 other followers were arrested by police. Mr. Hyo Won-yu, one of the earliest of Seoul members, wrote in his diary, "Teacher didn't come back. How could I sleep after leaving him alone there? I am just like Peter. I comforted our family who looked like a flock without a shepherd. I don't know if this is the last entry in this diary. Can you forget the words of promise? Can you go over the hill impossible to cross?" After 3 months of imprisonment, the final verdict was given to Reverend Moon. Innocent. All of the accusations by the university proved false. The newspapers reported the decision quietly in a small column on an inner page. But throughout Seoul, the scandal remained as fact. It was under these circumstances that he once again pieced his movement together and continued to teach. Membership quadrupled soon after the establishment of a headquarters in Seoul in 1955. Within a year, members were going out to witness to the local provinces for 40 days at a time. The result was 30 new churches by 1957. And by 1959, Korea boasted 70 churches, with pioneers in Europe, Japan, and America. In April of 1960, Reverend Moon married Hak Ja-han, a woman who had fled North Korea with her mother prior to the Korean War. For the church, it was the beginning of a new era, an age of maturity and of new commitment.
The remarkable aspect of the Unification Church is that it's led by a man and a woman, not just a man. Mrs. Moon, to me, is a woman of great graciousness, kindness, intelligence, and humor. She really embodies the spirit of woman. And I feel that to have a religious movement led by a man and woman indicates that it's man and woman together that transform humanity and transform the world.
From 1960 onward, weddings became increasingly large events within the church. It became the tradition for elders to ask Reverend and Mrs. Moon to suggest marriage partners, as people traditionally ask of their elders in the Orient. To accommodate the situation, Reverend Moon held ceremonies in which several of the couples were married simultaneously. There followed 36 couples in 1961, then 72 couples in 1962, 124 in 1963, 436 in 1968, 777 in 1970, 1,800 in 1975, and 8,000 couples in a joint ceremony between New York and Seoul in 1982.
Reverend Moon believes that the family is the basic unit for God's ideal in the world, and that in bringing people together from different traditions, different backgrounds, different nationalities, different personalities, Reverend Moon can help a couple resolve historical difficulties. It's not uncommon, for example, in our church for people of different races or nationalities to be suggested for matrimony. Now, whether they accept or not is up to the individuals, but certainly Reverend Moon has in mind that all of the historical conflicts can be resolved through a marriage. If, for example, you come from a tradition where blacks and whites have hated each other, if a couple can come together and black and white or Oriental and white marry, certainly that couple must work out all the historical difficulties. If we're going to build a new history, all of the tragedies, terrible things that have happened in the past must be somehow resolved, washed clean, so it can be a pure foundation for that new history. Thus, marriage is largely, for historical purposes, the building of a new future, children that will not have the same prejudices, the same bigotry, the same hatred.
Some people considered our large marriage some sort of strange rite, and it's very difficult for them to digest it. To me, as a participant in the marriage of 2,000 couples, it was a deeply personal experience. I felt that together with men and women from more than 80 nations, I was making a commitment to the future of the children of the world, to make it a place where war can take place no more.
On January 2nd, 1959, Ms. Young Eun Kim left Korea to pioneer the nation that, according to Reverend Moon's teaching, held the central role for the fulfillment of God's will in this age, America.
Coming to this continent, I simply felt awesome. The task was awesome, but I had to start very realistically from the grassroots, all alone. There was no one to consult anything, talk anything, share anything.
Doris Orm, the first person to join Miss Kim when she arrived in Oregon during the winter of 1960, shares her experience.
I would say I joined because God led me in deep way to, in many ways, in fact, all my life, I could say, even from a young child, I had had many experiences with God. Many, I would say, revelations in dream and other ways. I didn't understand that revelation, but later, when I read Divine Principle, I understood very fully what the meaning of that was, and that there would be a great disaster come to the world if man didn't awaken to a deeper realization of God.
What moved Doris Orm moved several others in that small town of Oregon. Within a few years, Miss Kim's small group had expanded to other cities. Most successful was the San Francisco Bay Area, which already had a reputation for thrusting new movements into the international limelight.
We called it center, and everybody had to find a job, and they went to work daytime. Usually they would bring someone in the evening to have dinner together and hear the Divine Principle lecture.
It was fantastic. I would say it was fantastic because we all loved one another deeply. As Reverend Moon said, you got to love one another. As Jesus told us, we got to love one another. And we loved one another. We were willing to die for one another.
We did pray a lot. We fasted a lot. And we've worked very hard. We were really worked hard at witnessing and teaching every day and every night.
We worked in restaurants. I worked sometimes 10 hours a day because I knew that I had to get the word of the Divine Principle out to the world. I felt the necessity because I could see the change in my own life taking place, and the people that accepted it, I could see my fellow, brothers and sisters changing before my own eyes.
The centers were small but spirited, and like the songs they sang, sprang from the hope for a new age of man.
When I first visited the center, I expected a much larger group and a larger situation, and actually it was a very small one-room apartment, and I was quite surprised to see the setting where they had one large blackboard in the living room and actually two people living in the center sharing the Divine Principle.
Betsy mentioned the idea of a newspaper ad, which we did use, and I think we had something like, great new message was like the first three words of the ad, but the many people in Berkeley, which was quite sexually liberal, read it as great new massage, and called us up with this kind of inquiry.
You learn to love someone by knowing them. It's easy to say, oh, I love all black people, I love all yellow people. But when you really live with them, when you wake up with them, when you brush your teeth with them, when you fight with them and then make a determination to overcome that conflict, then you can truly love them. It's not words anymore, but it's an actual lifestyle.
You know, I came to the United States in 1961, and I was assigned to a Korean embassy as assistant military attaché, serving 3.5 years as the military diplomat. And Reverend Moon just had only one advice. He said, you love God, you love America, and serve them as brothers and sisters. Do your heart and everything possible. Do not try to ask or get from them. You just go ahead, serve them.
But Dr. Pak soon did have another mission. Reverend Moon asked him to establish a children's singing and dance troupe to travel the globe. The Little Angels of Korea was formed in February of 1963.
I asked him, why children? How can I train the children and take them around the world, 30 kids, around the world, and it's just virtually impossible mission. He told me, the children are the symbol of peace. No one can communicate better message of peace than children. He said, children are the universal languages. So you take the children around the world. So I did. For 20 years, Little Angels of Korea performed more than 2,000 different places around the world in 70 different countries in all 6 continents.
The success of the Little Angels proved to many a skeptic that Reverend Moon's vision of international cultural exchange was not mere whimsical speculation. And in 1968, he furthered his conviction of its importance by founding the International Cultural Foundation. The foundation has sponsored some of the world's most prestigious conferences in sciences and the humanities. Most notable of these, of course, has been the International Conference on the Unity of the Sciences, which has since 1972 annually brought together distinguished scientists, Nobel laureates, and scholars to discuss the need for greater understanding among the sciences.
It is almost inevitable that that kind of conference would have to have been called by a religious organization, because only a religious organization maintains amidst the specialties of the modern world the sense of the unity of all disciplines and the unity of all creation. It gets to the point in some universities where people in one discipline hardly have anything to say to people in the other discipline. But what that kind of specialization forgets is that we really are talking about one world and one cosmos.
Originally intended as an effort to bring together professors from the historically conflicting countries of Japan and Korea, the Professors' World Peace Academy was founded by the Cultural Foundation in 1968. Since that time, it has quickly expanded to its present 50-nation membership, sponsoring a wide range of study groups, seminars, and publications aimed at world peace. In December of 1971, Reverend Moon arrived in the United States, a nation which at that time was being wrung of its convictions and drifting quickly away from many of the things Reverend Moon had come to champion.
To me, America is an obvious choice for Reverend Moon to work in. It is a center of communication. It is a center of people of all races and persuasions. It was inevitable that he had to come here in order to reach out to the world at large. If you can reach America, you can truly reach the entire world.
But how? How could a man who spoke no English proclaim a new truth to a nation that to him at that time must have seemed as unspeakably wanton as it was unmindful of its true destiny? Perhaps the question one should really ask is how anyone discerns a new truth from an old one, or better yet, how has anyone been able to discern the true motivation behind any of the teachers who have preached their messages on the streets of history?
Everybody is always selling some sort of truth, and that's the difficulty of the modern world. If you turn on a television set or you walk down Fifth Avenue, somebody is selling you something, and there's usually a customer. It's always necessary to look deeply into anything that pretends to be truth. Religion, to me, is the toughest business in the world, because it means you have to think about what you're doing. You have to analyze, evaluate, and reevaluate constantly. Loving your neighbor as yourself may be a simple maxim, but suppose your neighbor hates himself and you hate yourself, then what do? Obviously, all of a sudden, things get very complicated.
Despite the obstacles, Reverend Moon announced plans to do something he had never done, even in his native Korea. He decided to speak publicly. The plan was that Reverend Moon would speak in 7 major cities across the nation. To accomplish that, the American movement was organized into 2 groups of 70 members each, which acted as public relations teams in each city Reverend Moon would speak. The campaign was called the Day of Hope.
Still, at that point, many people didn't know anything about him at all, so this was an opportunity for America to hear his message, and that was my feeling more than anything else, was we were giving America this chance.
The success of the 7-city tour prompted a larger series of speaking engagements across the continent, a 21-city tour in 1973, and a 32-city tour in the winter of '74.
Well, I've been in the church about 13 years now, and when I look back on that period, that's the most hectic and most incredible period of my life in the church. We lived in a Winnebago truck, and we were traveling from city to city. I remember at the end of one tour, I believe it was the 21-city tour, we were all extremely exhausted, and we were so happy, and I think there were 1 or 2 cities left, and we were talking about how we were going to relax and so forth, and Reverend Moon spent the whole night up planning a tour that he would have just right at the end of the 21-city tour, the 32-city tour. And when we heard about that, we just could not believe it. It was totally amazing to us.
Well, up until that time, the church was populated by people who mostly had their own jobs in the regular kind of employment. And we would work for the church on the weekends and in the evenings. After Reverend Moon began his work here, people moved toward a more full-time involvement.
Oh, that was our first experience with fundraising, and none of us had ever done any of it before. So we went out very gingerly with these candles and brandy snifters. It was one of the hardest things in the world to be the first time you approach somebody, so cautiously with this candle. And it's amazing. It was hard. It was very hard at first.
Most people fail to realize that a young church gets money not by people writing a check at the end of the month, but by asking for donations. It's very common, for example, for religious movements to ask, would you like to make a contribution for what have you, a flower, something of that sort. It's certainly not the way to win friends and influence people. It is, however, the way to earn money to support your charitable, humanitarian, and religious projects.
Forgive, love, unite. Unlikely words for anyone living in a nation bent on the destruction of its president. If Americans were appalled by President Nixon's actions during the Watergate scandal, Reverend Moon was equally saddened by America's repulsion to his call for forgiveness, which was published in many of the nation's newspapers on November 30th of 1973. An event which to this day has been one of the greatest sources of misunderstanding of Reverend Moon and his movement.
He really, I think, wanted this country to go beyond accusing its president and realize that the president, as the leader of the country, is a symbol of the nation. And if we couldn't exercise Christian forgiveness in forgiving even a very sorry mistake done by President Nixon, that we couldn't really be forgiven ourselves as a nation. We all have our own little Watergates, after all, and we just couldn't forgive our own leader. It was a rather hypocritical thing, especially we felt on the part of the media.
Reverend Moon loves the ideal of what America can represent to God. It is a nation conceived ideally in liberty, in justice, in equality. Unfortunately, we don't always live up to our ideals, and therefore the tragedy of this nation. So Reverend Moon loves the best of what America can represent to the world and seeks to awaken that within the nation.
In September of '74, Reverend Moon embarked upon his final speaking tour entitled The New Future of Christianity. It was to be the turning point in Reverend Moon's American ministry, for after the speech at Madison Square Garden, there were few households in America which did not, at some point in their day, hear his name uttered.
Anyway, I don't know about Manhattan or the other boroughs, but in Manhattan they're becoming very difficult to avoid, this army of young zealots spreading the word about their path to salvation. The story report from Roger Sharp.
Attempting to save souls on the streets of New York is no easy task, but hardly a day goes by that you can't find a few people out peddling religion. None are more determined than the band of 1,000 volunteers who've been out the past couple of weeks heralding the September 18th rally at Madison Square Garden of Reverend Sun Myung Moon. Our town is blanketed with his posters.
We had different sections of areas that we went out and together in teams pasted up these flyers about Reverend Moon. I think the reason why we were all inspired is because it was his first really large public speech in New York, and we wanted this message from God to really come through. We wanted to really have New York understand the same message that inspired our lives.
We just didn't know what was going to happen. You know, we were out on the streets, we invited people, talked to people, and then that night when we saw the people just pouring in the doors, it was just such a wonderful feeling of joy inside.
말씀드리는 제목은 이미 아시다시피 기독교의 새로운 장르라는 제목을 가지고 말씀을 드려보겠습니다.
My topic tonight, as you know, is the new future of Christianity.
1974년 9월 18일은 하나님의 뜻을 중심 삼고 하나의 기원이 내려드는 선포의 날도.
He speaks Korean. His English is not the greatest. And Korean language is very robust, very masculine. It's like, you know, this way. And naturally, a Westerner, and we tend to be laid back in this generation, a Westerner is going to think, what is he saying, you know? And the point is that Reverend Moon has a very strong conviction beyond the language, and he expresses it deeply.
Being in this country maybe about 18 or 19 years by now, I came to understand that good speaker in this country is more like a subdued and also have a good sense of humor and so on. But being in an Oriental country, you don't necessarily have to do that in public speaking. If you have a conviction, do it forcefully.
For a moment, really think there is one historical puzzle that has not been solved. You know, 2,000 years ago, prior to coming of Jesus Christ, God prepared for that one day, for 4,000 years, chosen nation of Israel, giving so many...
You know, I tell you, probably I've been having the most difficult job under the sun, translating Reverend Moon, for following reason. Translation of Reverend Moon is not only the translation from one language to another, such as Korean to English, but actually I have to translate from one culture to another.
Coming back after the rally, we were again ready at 11 o'clock to get into our vans and go down and take down every single poster in one night. We really wanted to accomplish that. We wanted to show the unity and the power of unity. And I think that really came across because the next morning there were no posters anywhere in the city.
I can tell you.
The charge most often heard is that Reverend Moon destroys families. Perhaps there's never been a religious cult that has grown as fast while triggering as much controversy as the Unification Church. In a few short years, its leader, the self-ordained Reverend Sun Myung Moon,
usually I have a gut reaction of anger. So I have to digest my own anger and my own frustration that people have translated ignorance into prejudice and then multiplied it.
I think that when the movement first came to the United States, it made a lot of mistakes. And I believe that the mistakes that the movement made were partly connected with the fact that the transfer from the way things are said and done in the Orient to the way things are said and done in the United States involved a learning process.
What I suspect is more that the animosity of the general public and the mass media picking up on that comes from its being a new religion and unforgivably a successful one in terms of accomplishments to date, produces a certain threat. It's something like the new kid on the block.
My daughter has been in this organization for 4.5 years, almost 5 years. When she first got in,
spurred by consistently misleading reports in the news media, what could have been temporary misunderstanding of a new religious group became self-perpetuating hysteria. The hostile rhetoric against the church soon manifested itself in actions of increasing violence. Paid kidnappers solicited the families of church members, seeking commissions to abduct and coerce their adult children into recanting their beliefs. California church member John Biermans was abducted in San Francisco with the help of Canadian Federal Cabinet Minister Norm Caffik in September of '77.
I'd always thought that this was a free country. As a law student at that time, as a lawyer now, I'd always understood that we have a constitutional right to freedom of belief. However, during that process, that experience of being kidnapped and being challenged in my faith, I realized that they would not accept me with my beliefs as I had chosen them. I didn't ever imagine that I would have to be running away from my family and friends. Even for some time afterwards, I was afraid to even walk in the streets for fear that I would be pulled off the streets and again being forced to recant of my beliefs. Now, that changed through a process of my parents coming to visit and investigating, what I was actually doing. And the more they discovered, the more they saw me, the more they got to know me and more recently my wife, it eased their concern, and now I think they really believe that the church has been good for me, that I'm happy, and more above all that I really chose it of my own volition.
Well, journalism largely is involved with entertainment. It's very difficult for the media to take seriously religion. If you put the theology of any religion on the front pages of a newspaper, it can be mocked so easily, because religion is a very complex statement about the nature of life. Consequently, the grid of the journalist is often a very narrow grid. The journalist looks for one-liners rather than looking for the profundity of very complex ideas.
On June 7th, 1975, Reverend Moon gave his first public speech in his native Korea. Despite the event's obvious absence in the Western media, the Yoido Island Rally for Freedom was not only a statement of South Korea's changing attitude toward Reverend Moon, it proved to be the largest event ever held on Korean soil. 1.2 million people attended. Directly after the Yoido Rally, Reverend Moon asked for volunteers from each of 3 countries, America, Japan, and Germany, to become the first missionaries of unificationism to over 120 nations. Soon after the missionaries left, church members began the International Relief Friendship Foundation with the purpose of helping to alleviate poverty, malnutrition, and disease in many areas of the world. Today, many of the IRFF's projects are manned by church missionaries.
The missionaries actually they start the projects, and they really invest themselves in living with the people, teaching with the people, going through all the steps necessary to make a project successful. They're involved in short-term medical relief projects. We send doctors and nurses overseas to care for the people, and also long-term agricultural development and education and technical training.
With the movement expanding worldwide, the need for a theological center became obvious. In 1975, Reverend Moon founded the Unification Theological Seminary, which, because of its interreligious faculty and curriculum, may well be the only truly ecumenical seminary in Christendom. Establishing a seminary is an impressive accomplishment for any religious leader. What is surprising is that very same year, Reverend Moon founded what is referred to as the Juilliard of Korea, the Little Angels School for the Performing Arts. Located on the outskirts of Seoul, the philosophy of the school is based on the founder's conviction that art, as an expression of one's personality, should be done with a spirit of universality. Therefore, the school offers a very thorough curriculum for both general studies and the arts. Today, it stands as one of the most respected educational institutions in the Orient. Also houses a complete performing arts center, which, besides being the home of the Little Angels dancing troupe, also serves as the home for the recently formed Universal Ballet Company, a professional ballet troupe which has already scheduled tours of Asia, Europe, and America by 1988. When the American Bicentennial Committee forgot to mention God in its declaration of purpose, Reverend Moon sought to set the record straight by holding 2 rallies for the nation called God Bless America festivals. The first of these took place on a stormy night at Yankee Stadium in New York City on June 1st, 1976.
Jim Fleming and I were in charge of all the decorations, so when the letters went flying out of the infield and when our balloons were flying all over the place when they weren't supposed to be, and the microphones were filled with about a quarter of an inch of water, and the people that we were hiring to do the sound were ready to pack up and go away, actually started to pack up and head home because of so much rain and thunder. So that was an extremely hectic event, Yankee Stadium.
In his providence, God anointed America with oil. He poured out abundant blessing upon this land.
Despite its wet beginning, the success and momentum of the Yankee Stadium event easily paved the way for an even larger festival to be held on September 18th of that year. The God Bless America Festival at the Washington Monument was an American success story. Hard work and faith in a dream brought a result which told America that the new kid on the block was here to stay. A crowd estimated at 300,000 listened to Reverend Moon's address on America's blessing and responsibility at this time in history.
And when he walked out and he saw this big crowd, it was so wonderful just to see the smile on his face. And as he began to speak, I could see his face so clearly because I was watching it on TV. It just makes a nice feeling to be able to look at these large crowds and know that our work had been successful.
Aside from his personal experience in communist North Korea, Reverend Moon has watched communism's grim harvest of 2/3 of the world within his lifetime. To him, communism is a direct affront to humanity, not only because it sees man as a materialistic being purely, but because it gives license to treat him as such. For this reason, Reverend Moon has sought to provide an alternative to communism's atheistic worldview. Aside from organizations in the Orient and on campuses around the world, he most recently founded Causa International, an organization which derives its name from the Spanish word for great purpose.
Many Americans tend to view anti-communist movements with a great deal of suspicion. I think part of it harkens back to the McCarthy days. In contrast, Causa has done a very thorough research and study of the contradictions of communism, their unmet goals, their false promises, and in that sense presents, I think, a very studied, very well-researched, very intellectual framework upon which people can learn. We find that if there's one basic premise that pervades all the teachings of communism, it is the premise that there is no God.
Aside from his own treatment by the American media, Reverend Moon felt that the nation was lacking a fair voice in much of what was being reported. In April of 1976, he formed the News World Communications, which became the publisher of 2 New York dailies, the New York Tribune and Noticias del Mundo. Aside from sponsoring the World Media Association, an organization formed to promote responsibility in the media, News World Communications recently established itself firmly in the nation's capital with the Washington Times.
But we are very grateful here at the Washington Times to the Reverend Moon, to Dr. Park and his associates for having provided us with what I consider to be a magnificent fighting ship in the war of words and the war of ideas, which is the only war going on in the world today. The marvelous thing about the Washington Times is that we are presenting for the first time in this country's recent history alternative views insofar as editorials are concerned, and insofar as reporting is concerned, stories that the other major media outlets are ignoring for a variety of reasons. We have broken countless stories since I've been here that you will not find in other major media outlets to such a degree that they have had to pick them up from us and give us credit for them. When I was in Europe recently, I was delighted to hear the Washington Times quoted every hour on the hour on the Voice of America and on the BBC, to worldwide radio networks that happen to reach hundreds of millions of people.
The first thing that has to be understood about Reverend Moon is that he's not a preacher. What he basically is a man who believes that God has inspired him to help transform the world, and his vision of world transformation is rooted in his religious beliefs.
He recognizes, however, that religious traditions have often fallen away from that primary relationship to God, and rather than establishing a model of love within their own communities, there is an emphasis on the externals of religion rather than the internal heart and spirit of love.
For that reason, and for the purpose of bringing greater harmony among all the world's religions, Reverend Moon established the International Religious Foundation. Foremost among its activities has been the annual Conference on God, which brings together many of the world's religious leaders and scholars in an ecumenical dialogue.
As representatives of the world's religions, you are called to bring your churches, mosques, synagogues, shrines, and temples into a cooperative unity for the sake of world peace and human freedom centered on God.
The foundation also sponsors the Youth Seminar on World Religions, an annual pilgrimage by over 150 students who visit the important centers of the world's major religions. Its purpose is to help young people understand the central reality of God in all religions.
But what you see most clearly is this sort of opening up to other people, opening up to people of different races and religions that formerly just hadn't had any reality. They hadn't seen like people that you could really relate to. And over we see that.
In October 1981, the U.S. federal government indicted Reverend Moon on charges of tax evasion. The pretext they chose was a bank account held for the church in his name, a practice done by many religious leaders in this country. The fact that the monies in the account were used for church purposes was ignored. By innuendo, the prosecution implied that because Reverend Moon often decided how the funds were spent, he was the actual owner. The jury turned in a guilty verdict, and the judge sentenced Reverend Moon to 18 months in prison.
Reverend Moon's total tax liability, as I have studied it and as others have studied it, and I'm not talking about church members here, I happen to be a Roman Catholic, and clearly I studied this problem very seriously before accepting employment at the Washington Times as editor-in-chief. His total tax liability is less than $10,000 for 3 years. No one goes to jail for that in this country.
Because it set a precedent for the restriction of rights of all religious people, the refusal of the Supreme Court to hear the case sparked outrage.
Talked about men like the Reverend Sun Myung Moon. And they said, put him in jail. We don't care if how he's jailed is right or wrong. Just get him off the streets. And we contend that the government of the land does not have the right to interfere into the affairs of the church. And we've called for his pardon.
Rallies protesting the government's violation of First Amendment rights took place in Washington and Houston, and ministers across the country pledged to spend 1 week in jail with Reverend Moon as a statement of their solidarity with his plight.
He said, I came to the prison to love America more. When he scrubbed the kitchen floor, he said, I'm cleaning up the American floor. When I distribute the food to the prisoners, I'm feeding God's children. What a joy, without coming to prison. How can I do this kind of chore? When I think of God, there's nothing I cannot do, without being gratitude. This is how he lived.
After spending 13 months in the federal penitentiary in Danbury, Connecticut, Reverend Moon was released on August 20th, 1985. That day in Washington, D.C., over 1,700 religious leaders gathered to welcome him back by holding a banquet in his honor.
You are welcoming me here today, then as you and I know, is not a personal welcome for the individual, Reverend Moon, but is a testament of that will of God, for which I have lived my life, to do the will of God. Is our common and utmost concern. God cannot reside within narrow views. He does not recognize the walls of nationalism, our cultural tradition. He is trying to his very hardest today to embrace all of humanity. Throughout my life, I have communicated deeply with God, and through numerous spiritual experiences, I have come to know His heart and His law. I have always testified to this. To me, God is not a vague God residing in the realm of imagination. God is alive, and I relate to Him directly in my heart. I experience Him in every cell of my body.
Once you taste the love of God, nothing is greater, nothing is more valuable for you. You will hold it for eternity. You have to practice the love of God. You cannot be near to God by just looking at heaven, no, nothing. Only by passionate love to other human beings, God comes so close to you right away. If you fail that, yeah, this movement is very hard to follow.
He said, I'm looking forward to the day God smile. He look upon His children, His smile, rejoice, dancing with us. Do you know that's the day of kingdom of heaven? He said.
Or for a free catalog of related publications, please call toll-free 1-800-634-4600. Or you can write Faith and Reality, 4 West 43rd Street, New York, New York, 10036.